Marco and his sister Giulia inherit a crumbling farmhouse in the hills of Sicily, near the small village of Monreale. What should have been a straightforward restoration project becomes a descent into forgotten history when a supporting wall collapses during renovation, revealing a sealed chamber beneath the floorboards. Inside lies something impossible to ignore. Human remains arranged in careful positions, clay tablets carved with symbols, and evidence of a space hidden deliberately for centuries. The symbols don't match anything local. The bones suggest a methodical burial, not a natural death. Old documents in the village archives whisper of heretical sects, hidden communities, and accusations during the Spanish Inquisition. As Marco and Giulia dig deeper, connecting fragments of stone inscriptions with dusty church records, they attract attention, not all of it friendly. A rival archaeologist and a representative from the local diocese both want the chamber sealed and forgotten. But Marco cannot ignore what his house is trying to tell him. Someone chose to hide these remains and their story, and 400 years later, the stones are finally breaking their silence. Chapter 1. The Inheritance. The farmhouse stood alone on a ridge overlooking the Conca d'Oro Valley, its terracotta roof half collapsed, its walls cracked like aged skin. Marco stopped the truck at the property line and simply stared. This was supposed to be his fresh start. A retirement investment. A place to escape Milan's suffocating winters. Instead, he saw only work. "It's worse than the photographs," Giulia said, stepping down from the passenger seat. His sister was a conservator by trade, accustomed to analyzing decay and damage with clinical precision. If anyone could salvage this, it was her. But even she looked uncertain. The keys hung heavy in Marco's palm, inherited along with the deed from their grandmother's cousin, a woman neither had met. The notary had been vague about the property's history, built in the 1600s as a farmhouse, possibly on the foundation of something older. No recent owners had stayed longer than 2 years. They approached through an overgrown garden where lemon trees had gone wild, their scent sharp and almost aggressive in the warm Sicilian air. The front door required both of them to shoulder it open. Inside, sunlight streamed through broken shutters, illuminating dust motes and the faint smell of mold, stone, and something else. Something mineral and old that Marco couldn't quite name. Giulia ran her fingers along the interior wall, examining cracks radiating from the central beam. "Load-bearing wall is compromised. We'll need to reinforce the entire structure before—" She stopped, pointing to a gap in the plaster where the beam met the foundation. "That's unusual." Marco knelt beside her. The gap was deliberate, too regular to be accidental. A space perhaps 3 fingers wide, running horizontally behind the plaster. Curiosity drew him close. Inside the gap, something glinted. It was a coin, silver, small, corroded black with age. Beyond it, he glimpsed others, layered in what looked like clay or mortar that had hardened to stone. "There's something behind here," Marco said. Giulia's expression shifted from skepticism to intense focus. "Don't touch anything. I'll get the documentation kit from the truck." But as she stood to leave, a groan echoed through the old house. The central beam sagged visibly, a crack spiderwebbed across the ceiling. Before either of them could move, the supporting wall gave way with the sound of breaking bone multiplied 1,000 times. They dove aside. Stone crashed down in a catastrophic rush, the ancient plaster exploding into powder. The air filled with dust so thick they couldn't breathe. Marco's ears rang. Through the murk he heard Giulia coughing, and relief flooded through him. She was alive. When the dust settled, they stared at what the collapse had revealed. The wall had crumbled inward, exposing a dark chamber beneath the farmhouse floor. The space beyond was impossibly deep, descending into shadow, and even from 10 meters away, even through the haze of stone dust, Marco could see them. Bones arranged in careful geometrical patterns across the chamber floor, and stone tablets covered in symbols that belonged to no alphabet he recognized. Chapter 2. The Discovery. They did not enter the chamber that day. Giulia insisted on proper protocol. Documentation before excavation, photographs before disturbance. Contact with regional authorities before any further movement. Marco agreed, though his mind was already racing through possibilities. Inquisition victims? Medieval plague victims? Something far older? That night, they stayed in a pensione in Montreal, unable to sleep. Marco found Julia in the common room at 3 a.m, surrounded by books she'd borrowed from a monk at the adjacent cathedral. Texts on Sicilian history, church records, anything about the region's medieval past. "There's a pattern," she said, gesturing to sketches she'd made of the symbols. "These aren't random, see? They repeat. This crossed circle, this spiral with 7 points, this broken cross. They were intentional. Someone was sending a message or recording something." Marco pulled up the photographs on his phone. In the chamber, the bones had been arranged in concentric circles, each figure positioned with its hands folded precisely across its chest. Not a mass grave, not bodies thrown in collapse. This was a ritual arrangement, deliberate and purposeful. "Medieval cemetery?" he suggested. "No. The postures are wrong. The depth is wrong. Medieval burials were horizontal in consecrated ground." Julia tapped the image of one skeleton. "And look at this. There's a hole in the skull. Not trauma. Deliberate. Trepanation, maybe. Or..." She trailed off, disturbed by her own inference. The next morning brought authorities. An archaeologist from the regional museum, a woman named Dr. Rossana Mancini with sharp eyes and sharper questions. She descended into the chamber with professional efficiency, photographing, measuring, taking samples. Her expression grew increasingly troubled. "How long has this been sealed?" she asked, emerging after 2 hours. "The farmhouse was built in the 1600s, Marco said, "but the foundation is older. Could be medieval." "This isn't medieval." Mancini's voice was quiet. "The preservation is too good, the arrangement too deliberate, and these symbols..." She held up an image of one tablet. "I've seen variations of these in documents related to the Spanish Inquisition. Hidden communities, groups that practiced unconventional faiths." A shadow crossed her face as she spoke, as though she were violating some unspoken code simply by naming the possibility aloud. That's when the phone call came. Chapter 3. The Intervention. The man on the phone identified himself as Father Gaetano Vitali from the Diocesan Office of Sacred Heritage. His voice was smooth, practiced, deeply familiar with authority. "I understand there has been a discovery at your property in Montreal," he said to Marco. "The regional museum has filed a preliminary report. I will be visiting tomorrow to assess the religious and historical significance of the remains." It wasn't a request. That evening, Dr. Mancini pulled Marco aside. "Be careful what you tell him. The church has sensitivities about certain periods of its history. Heretical groups, heterodox practices, anything that suggests the institution failed in its spiritual authority. These things get buried." "Literally?" Marco asked. "Sometimes literally." Father Vitali arrived the next morning, driving an expensive sedan that looked absurdly out of place on the country road. He was younger than Marco expected, perhaps 60, with gray temples and the kind of physical fitness that suggested discipline. He blessed the property before entering, making the sign of the cross with practiced grace. In the chamber, his demeanor changed. He moved slowly among the bones, his expression unreadable. When he saw the tablets, something flickered across his face. Recognition, perhaps, or fear. "These remains must be removed for proper ecclesiastical assessment here," he announced finally. "The symbols may indicate heretical practice. The church needs to determine if these individuals died without last rites, if their souls require intercession." "This is an archaeological site," Dr. Mancini protested. "These remains are historical evidence. They need scholarly examination." "They are also possibly the remains of excommunicated individuals," Vitali replied calmly. "The church's interest supersedes archaeological preference." Marco felt the weight of centuries settling into the chamber, all those secrets, all that buried history, suddenly very heavy, very present, and fiercely contested. If you're enjoying this adventure so far, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Chapter 4. The Archives. Julia refused to let the chamber close. While Father Vitali arranged ecclesiastical procedures and Dr. Mancini fought bureaucratic battles, Marco and his sister spent their days in the Monreale Cathedral archives, searching for any mention of the symbols, the hidden chamber, or the community that had placed those careful bones beneath the earth. The archives were a maze of deteriorating documents, marriage records, baptisms, death certificates dating back to the 1500s, but there were also gaps, entire years missing, records that had clearly been removed or destroyed, and then, in a sealed box marked Heresies, 1600, they found it. An inquisitor's report, written in formal Latin, describing a community of the hidden light that had operated in the hills near Monreale. The text spoke of unauthorized rituals, of women performing sacred functions, of communion outside church authority, of symbols that represented not Christian orthodoxy, but something older, something that predated Rome's dominance, drawn from pre-Christian Mediterranean traditions. The inquisitor's conclusion was damning. The community must be dispersed, the heretics brought to trial, and if unrepentant, executed. Their remains should be denied Christian burial, their property should be confiscated. But there was a date margin note in different handwriting. Fled to the southern caves. Hidden. Community survived. Survived. The word opened 1,000 questions. Marco found Julia staring at the document, tears on her cheeks. They were trying to preserve something, she whispered. Some form of faith, or knowledge, or practice that the church wanted erased. And they did it so carefully. They buried their own dead with ritual. They hid them beneath a house they knew would be built. They wanted them found someday, but safely. Protected. That night, Marco received an anonymous call. A man's voice accented, urgent. Stop asking questions about the chamber. Some histories are dangerous when brought into light. Some secrets were buried for reason. The line went dead before Marco could respond. Chapter 5. The rival Dr. Mancini's reputation preceded the archaeologist who arrived 3 days later, Dr. Antonio Grasso from the University of Palermo, known for controversial theories about pre-Christian Mediterranean religions and their suppression by institutional Christianity. He was also known for his willingness to circumvent bureaucratic channels to access historical material. He came to the farmhouse with permits, credentials, and a team, and he brought news that changed everything. The bones are at least 450 years old, he told Marco and Julia, displaying his team's preliminary carbon dating. That places them squarely in the period of maximum inquisitorial activity, and the symbols. He showed them photographs of tablets under high-resolution imaging. They're a hybrid language, Greek, Latin, older Mediterranean scripts, and something that matches no known written system, possibly a deliberately created code. Why would they do that? Marco asked. To preserve knowledge that the church was systematically destroying. Women's spiritual authority, pre-patriarchal religious practice, connections to goddess worship, to fertility rites, to systems of faith that Rome and Christianity wanted erased from history. Grasso's eyes blazed with the fervor of intellectual discovery. That chamber is a library of hidden knowledge, a time capsule of suppressed spirituality. But within hours, Father Vitali had the site cordoned off with official seals. Grasso's permits were questioned. The regional museum suddenly faced bureaucratic obstacles. Dr. Mancini reported that higher church authorities were demanding the remains be transferred to a facility in Vatican City itself for proper ecclesiastical assessment. Marco understood what was happening, the burial of the burial, the erasure of the erasure. One evening, he found Grasso at the property line, staring down at the farmhouse. The archaeologist looked defeated. They're going to destroy them, Grasso said quietly. Or hide them. Store them in some warehouse where they'll never see daylight, never be studied, never tell their story. I've seen it before. The church buries what threatens its narrative of unbroken spiritual authority. Then we fight, Marco said. Grasso turned to him with sad certainty. With what? You're a businessman. Your sister's a conservator. I'm an academic they're already marginalizing. Against an institution with 15 centuries of practice in controlling history? We don't have a chance. But as he spoke, Grasso was photographing the farmhouse, the surrounding landscape, every detail of the property, backing up the documentation, preserving the evidence they could preserve. If this treasure hunt already has you hooked, hit the like button. It helps us bring more forgotten stories to light. Chapter 6. The Memory Remains. The official report concluded that the remains in the chamber were victims of plague from the 1600s, their ritual arrangement a product of local superstition and religious practice common to the period. No evidence of heresy, no evidence of intentional suppression, nothing to suggest that centuries of hidden history required examination or protection. The bones were transferred to the Vatican's archives, access restricted. The tablets were declared ecclesiastical property, requiring further study in Rome. The chamber was sealed, the supporting wall rebuilt, and the farmhouse given a certificate of structural restoration. But Dr. Grasso had done his work well. Photographs were published in academic journals. The symbol analysis appeared in conferences on pre-Christian Mediterranean spirituality. The dating evidence entered scholarly databases. The story, not the official story but the true story, began to circulate among historians, archaeologists, and researchers who understood what erasure looked like and refused to accept it. Marco and Giulia transformed the farmhouse into a small museum and guest house. The wall where the chamber had been became the centerpiece, preserved behind reinforced glass, protected, visible. They hired local guides to explain the history, the investigation, the ongoing questions about who had lived in that community, and what knowledge they had tried to protect. Visitors came from across Europe. Scholars requested access. The story that the church had tried to bury transformed into something the church could not silence. Not the bones themselves, but the memory of them, the questions they raised, the consciousness they demanded. On the anniversary of the discovery, Marco stood in the sealed chamber, now visible through protective barriers, and placed his hand against the cool stone where the bones had lain. Somewhere in the Vatican, those remains were stored in darkness. But here, in this small farmhouse on a Sicilian ridge, their story lived. Their ritual remained. Their refusal to be forgotten had triumphed over institutional silence. The true treasure was never the bones, never the symbols, never the hidden history itself. It was the act of bearing witness. It was the decision to say, these people existed, they believed something worth protecting, and their memory matters more than any authority that would erase them. Some stories, Marco understood now, cannot be buried forever. Some truths, once touched by sunlight, refuse to return to darkness. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales of discovery and hidden history. See you in the next adventure.